After my sister's death, my homophobic mother blamed me. But I found my sister's journal, and it changed everything. Hey everyone, I'm 23M and gay, raised in a very conservative family with a homophobic mother 54F and sister 26F. Our mother was always the so-called tough love type of parent who did not hesitate to scream at both of us if we did anything wrong, and sometimes would even refuse to give us any pocket money if she considered the offense to be too bad. My sister was able to minimize contact with my mom after moving out. I was also working towards that before my mom fell sick and became entirely dependent on me. Both me and my sister ended up having certain mental health issues because it runs in the family. I mentioned myself being gay because neither my mom nor my sister were in any way supportive of me when I decided to come out when I was like 20. We got into fights, then they both gave me silent treatment. But my sister was able to put her beliefs aside and still spend time with me like we used to before my coming out. My mom, however, wouldn't stop with her nasty remarks about me going to hell and whatnot, but I endured it all to take care of her. To put it very short, my sister ended up taking her own life 2 weeks ago. It was especially hurtful because she spent some of her last moments with me. We went out with her husband to dine, we attended our cousin's wedding and had so much fun, etc. It seemed like things were going back to normal when it came to our relationship, and then all of a sudden, she just ended it. My mom was completely destroyed by what happened, and I had to spend even more time with her because it worsened her condition. She kept asking if I did something to my sister, if I fought her and pushed her into ending her life. I just ignored her because I thought that after the initial shock of it all dies down, she will calm down. But she just wouldn't stop asking me if we had a fight, if I said something bad, if I insulted her, if I said something to her husband. I said no, I haven't done anything. Then she brings up me being gay again. She says me being gay killed my sister and that she couldn't handle her brother being that dirty and couldn't handle having me as family. That's when I had enough and said that if she keeps on trying to blame my sister's tragic death on me, she's going to have to deal with her sickness by herself, and that she won't have me there to help anymore. She said that I'm a failure of a son, and that with my sister's death she lost everything that was ever important to her. My brother-in-law said that I went too far with threatening to leave my sick mom all by herself, and now I'm still feeling terribly guilty for saying that. Update 1. It's been a brutal few weeks, but I'm here with an update because things took a turn I never saw coming. After my sister's funeral, I was at my breaking point. My mom's health was declining, but so was my patience. Her constant barrage of accusations and pointed remarks about my lifestyle wore me down. I'd wake up with a knot in my stomach just thinking about how to survive another day of her blame games. For a while, I held off on leaving entirely, out of some lingering sense of obligation or guilt. I don't know. I made myself feel better by setting boundaries, only stopping by to handle her meds and groceries, and steering clear of any real conversations. But it wasn't enough. I thought the silent treatment would make her rethink things. It didn't. One day, she called me and went right back to accusing me of somehow driving my sister to suicide. She dropped a new line, saying my sister couldn't handle the burden of having a disgraceful brother, which made her question everything about our family, her life, and herself. I lost it. I snapped at her, saying if she kept going, I'd walk out the door for good, and she could figure out how to survive without me. Her reaction? She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Maybe you should have been the one to die. Your sister was my only good child." It was like a slap in the face. For a moment I could barely breathe. That's when I realized I was completely done. I told her she'd just made things easy for me, and I left, not looking back. After that, I went no contact. My guilt started to fade as I kept my distance. But then, my brother-in-law messaged me, asking to meet. He said he had something important to tell me. I was hesitant. He hadn't reached out since the funeral, and our last interaction wasn't exactly warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling there was something I needed to hear. We met at a small cafe. He looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying the weight of the world since my sister's death. I wasn't prepared for what he showed me, a journal my sister had been keeping, apparently for years. I almost didn't want to touch it. The thought of learning what had been going on in her mind was terrifying, but he insisted. "You need to know," he said. So I sat there, flipping through her words, and everything I thought I understood about my sister and our family started to unravel. The entries revealed things she never let on. She'd felt isolated for years, caught in the middle between me and our mom, trying to be the good child who would keep the family together while silently battling her own struggles. She wrote about how deeply she hated herself for standing by while I took the brunt of our mom's anger, and how torn she was between loyalty to her family and her growing resentment of the homophobia and cruelty we'd both faced. There were sections about her inner conflict, about how she'd secretly resented me for coming out because it forced her to face the reality of our mother's bigotry. But at the same time, she hated herself for feeling that way, knowing deep down that her anger was misplaced. She felt trapped in an endless cycle of guilt, shame, and anger. Then there were passages about the weight she carried, pretending to be okay, pretending to have her life together while struggling internally. She'd been unhappy in her marriage too, feeling like she'd just fallen into a life that made sense on paper, but not in her heart. She wrote that our mom's constant pressure and judgment had led her to make choices she didn't even want, and it was too late to change any of them. The final entry before her death was gut-wrenching. She wrote about how exhausted she was, how she felt like she'd failed everyone. Her husband, me, herself. There was no single thing she blamed, just an overwhelming sadness, a feeling that nothing would ever change. She described it as feeling like she was standing in quicksand, watching herself sink, unable to scream for help. Reading those words was brutal, but it made me realize her death wasn't some knee-jerk reaction to anything I'd done. It wasn't even about me at all. She was a victim of our upbringing, just like I was. I had been so wrapped up in my own hurt, in the constant need to defend myself, that I hadn't seen the toll it was taking on her too. For years, she'd been silently suffering, caught between the need to please our mom and the pain of watching her own brother become the family's scapegoat. Her death was the tragic result of years of unresolved pain, guilt, and an impossible choice between love and loyalty. After that meeting, I went back to my mom's house. I felt like I owed it to my sister to confront her. I walked in with the journal in hand, told her to sit down, and started reading entries. She tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. I read about the times my sister saw our mom belittle me and did nothing, feeling helpless. I read about the conflict my sister felt, the hatred she had for herself for staying quiet, and how she kept going to please our mother, even at the cost of her own happiness. My mom looked stunned, like she was hearing about her daughter for the first time. I could see her face harden as I read about how my sister felt our family's narrow-minded beliefs were strangling her, slowly breaking her spirit. Finally, I closed the journal, looked at my mom, and said, "This is the legacy you built. This is what your tough love did." She sat there, eyes red, breathing hard, but still didn't say a word. I didn't know what else to say, so I just left the journal with her. She whispered, "I didn't know," like that was somehow an excuse. I left, feeling a strange sense of closure. I knew that no amount of explanation would change anything. My mother would probably never truly understand the damage she'd caused. For a few days after, I felt hollow. But eventually, I noticed something had shifted. I was done carrying her expectations, her guilt, and the weight of being the son she never wanted. I had finally put all of it down. It's hard to explain, but I finally felt free. I no longer felt like I was a part of this twisted cycle of blame and guilt that had controlled my life for so long. I wasn't going to keep carrying the legacy of her hate. Update 2. After leaving the journal with my mom, I decided to fully cut ties. For the first time, I felt like I didn't owe her anything, not my attention, my explanations, or my guilt. I tried to focus on rebuilding my life, dealing with my grief, and just breathing without constantly waiting for the next crisis. It felt strange at first. There was always a hollow feeling when I thought about my sister, like a part of me had been scooped out. But there was also a release. No more accusations, no more toxic comments, no more endless guilt trips. A few weeks into my no-contact decision, I started focusing on myself in a way I never had before. I went back to therapy, which I'd put on hold after my sister's death, and unpacked everything. My therapist had me walk through what letting go meant in my life. It was hard to describe, but I found myself letting go of the guilt over my sister's death. I realized I'd been blaming myself, not just because of what my mom had said, but because deep down, I'd been afraid that maybe she was right. Maybe my being open about who I am had somehow disrupted things in ways I couldn't fix. But reading my sister's words, her private confessions about how trapped she'd felt, showed me her struggles had been so much deeper and older than I'd ever understood. The truth was, she'd been fighting her own battles long before I came out. Around this time, my brother-in-law reached out again. He wanted to meet, saying he had more of her things that he thought I should have. I agreed to meet him, not sure what to expect. I arrived at a quiet park, where he was waiting with a small box. He handed it to me, and we sat down on a bench. He opened up in a way he never had before, telling me about the last few months of my sister's life. He admitted he'd felt helpless too, watching her become increasingly withdrawn, unable to reach her despite his attempts. He said she'd spoken about wanting to fix things with me, about how she regretted our lost years, and how deeply she felt the pain of our mother's rejection towards me. But he also said something I didn't expect. She'd been hiding another secret. Apparently, my sister had been going to therapy for nearly a year, processing a lot of trauma from our childhood and our mom's treatment of me. In her sessions, she'd come to terms with things she'd never told me about, things about our mom's past that I hadn't known. My brother-in-law said that my sister had learned our mom had been deeply hurt by her own parents, that the same kind of tough-love parenting had been handed down to her, with layers of shame and rejection. My sister felt it explained a lot about our mom's attitude, how she'd been warped by her own upbringing, but instead of stopping the cycle, she'd passed that same damage on to us. My sister had written that she wanted to break that cycle, and that part of her frustration and shame was rooted in feeling like she hadn't been strong enough to stand up to our mother on my behalf. It was gutting to hear. She'd carried so much, far more than I'd realized, trying to bear the weight of our family's dysfunction, trying to be the one to fix things. I sat there, stunned, holding the box and trying to process all this new information. He told me that my sister had kept a handful of things that had been meaningful to her. Photos, letters, little mementos from our childhood. She'd kept them all in this box, and he thought she'd want me to have them. When I got home, I opened it up and started going through her things. There were old pictures of us as kids, grinning in our terrible 90s clothes, memories from better times when we were just kids, unburdened by the complexities of family dynamics. Then I found a letter she'd written to me, but never sent. In it, she wrote about how much she missed me, and how she wanted to rebuild our relationship, how she knew that time had strained things between us, but that she loved me, even if she couldn't say it out loud because of our mom. There was one line that stood out, haunting me. "I've tried to be the daughter she wanted and the sister you deserve, but I'm not sure I can be both." That line hit me hard. She'd been trying to walk a tightrope, caught between two impossible roles, and it had broken her. It was the first time I fully understood that her death wasn't my fault, that it wasn't about me, even though I'd convinced myself it was. Her struggles were her own, tangled up in her desire for approval, her internalized shame, and her love for me that she didn't know how to show. This revelation shifted something inside me. I realized that I'd been living under the shadow of our mom's expectations and judgments, just like my sister had. The difference was I'd chosen to rebel, while my sister had tried to conform, hoping it would bring her the love and acceptance she craved. But in the end, neither path had freed us from our mother's grip. I knew then that the only way to truly honor my sister's memory was to live authentically and build a life that wasn't dictated by shame or fear. In a strange twist, my mom reached out a few days later. She'd somehow heard from our neighbor that I'd met with my brother-in-law again, and she wanted to talk. I felt a familiar pang of resentment, a knee-jerk desire to shut her down. But after everything I'd learned, I decided to go. I was curious, in a detached way, to see if she'd say anything different. When I arrived, she looked different. More tired, more vulnerable somehow. She said she'd been reading through my sister's journal, the one I'd left behind, and she couldn't stop thinking about the things she'd read. She said she felt like she was finally seeing herself through my sister's eyes and that it was painful. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she admitted she'd spent her life trying to mold us into her idea of a good family, the kind of family she'd always wanted but had never had. She confessed she'd lost sight of us as individuals, as people with our own needs and feelings. She even said she'd treated my sister's obedience as proof of her worth and my rebellion as a personal betrayal, as though my choices were somehow an attack on her. But in the end, she realized it was her own insecurities driving all of this. I sat there, numb, listening to her say all the things I'd needed to hear for years, but feeling strangely indifferent. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate her apology. It just felt like too little, too late. I could see she was waiting for some grand gesture of forgiveness, some sign that things would go back to normal. But I knew there was no going back. I told her I was glad she'd read the journal, that maybe it would give her some closure, but that I couldn't be the one to heal her. I'd spent enough of my life carrying her pain, her expectations, and her judgments, and I wasn't going to do it anymore. I told her I was moving forward, for me, and that my life was no longer about trying to prove myself to her or anyone else. She looked devastated, but she nodded, as if she understood. I could see the realization dawn on her face that I was really done, that this was a goodbye of sorts. As I walked out, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, like I'd finally cut the last thread, tying me to a version of myself I no longer wanted to be. I'd come to accept that some relationships just can't be repaired, and that's okay. My sister's memory would always be with me, but I wouldn't let her struggles define my life. I'd carry forward her love, her spirit, and her desire to break free from the chains of our upbringing, but I'd do it on my own terms. I wasn't going to let the pain of the past dictate my future anymore.